Perfect.
Okay, thanks, Flo. First of all, just a very quick apology on got a microphone failure on my main computer, so I've got two logins. So you might not be able to see me speaking, but I am visible on video somewhere on your grid. The reason why we're talking about this now, Flo was hinting this is coming rapidly up the agenda, polar geoengineering, and it directly impacts those of us working in instant and on related fields in Antarctica. And there's two reasons probably why we're talking about polar geoengineering now. The reason why we're talking about it at all is that it challenges some of our thinking, some of our understanding of the basic processes going on in the ice ocean atmosphere system in Antarctica and the Arctic, particularly. And some of those things we just don't know the answers to yet. Some of these proposals require knowledge of the system we don't have. So first of all, it's getting at our fundamental knowledge. But secondly, it's rapidly coming up the agenda at policy level in terms of the COPs and in terms of climate negotiations. Polar geoengineering is now being talked about seriously. But the evaluation of those ideas has perhaps not been as structured or as critical as it might have been. It's not been these things haven't been fully evaluated by other polar scientists. So I'm really pleased that Martin has been leading a paper trying to look at some of these issues. It's a first step. And Martin's going to talk about that paper for about 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, a question and answer session afterwards, where we'll take questions from the chat, or if you can raise your hand using the React raise hand function, and we'll try and have a discussion up until the end of the hour, wherever you are. Just briefly, Martin is a glaciologist and geophysicist. He's currently Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Exeter University, retains links to Imperial College, where he was co-director of the Grantham Institute, which is one of the world's leading institutes on climate change and climate impacts research. Martin's well known to many people with his geophysical work in Antarctica over many decades, particularly around subglacial lakes. But I think it's fair to say he's moved more and more into kind of looking at the future of Antarctica with his recent work and some of his publications. So Martin, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about this, and then we'll come back to Q&A at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Flo, and good to see some familiar faces. It's nice to talk to you this afternoon, wherever you are, about polar geoengineering. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, hang on, sharing's not turned on. A request has been sent. I think, Flo, you have to... Have you done that? Oh, we can. Okay. Flo, just give me the thumbs up. You can see the screen.
We can see that.
Okay, that's cool. So, getting into polar geoengineering is not something I ever wanted to do. It's not something I really paid much attention to. I heard about it a few years ago, and some of the ideas that were coming up, and I just sort of ignored it, really, thinking, well, these are verging on being crazy and unlikely to get any traction, and really didn't give it much attention. And then for me anyway, it was at COP28, so that was in Dubai. We started seeing geoengineering ideas in the polar regions, we should add about that, really getting some traction at sort of policy level, and definitely in the media. And so I have to say that it was BBC was doing articles on it. Some of the newspapers in the United Kingdom were, New Scientist, you name it. And all of a sudden there's some sort of visibility being given to some of these ideas that are nothing more really than sort of just fledgling ideas. And there was no real response to it. There was no academic response to it. And I think the reason for that is because many of us just thought, well, these things are just so impossible. Don't give them any attention, because it's a sort of negative thing to do, isn't it? Spending any time trying to stop something else means you can't do the other things which are more important, possibly. But it got to such a condition at COP28 that many of us thought, well, we can't just let this go unchallenged, because we think there is a broad community, sensible community that wants to say something about this. And so I and Heidi Sylvester and Flo and Mike and a whole bunch of other people put a sort of team together to do just that, to investigate it. And you got a link in the chat to the paper. It's a preprint at the moment. It's in review with Frontiers in Science. We're just going through the reviews right now, hoping to send those back to the editor in a few weeks' time. But this is the list of names that you've got here, and you can kind of scout through it. There's over 40 of them down here, and actually there's quite a few more that we might have brought into it. There's a collection of people here ranging from glaciologists to oceanographers to sea ice experts to atmospheric scientists to policy people to environmental protection people, a full range of different organizations from a full range of countries and associations as well. So it's quite an eclectic gathering of people, but with the collective expertise that can really authoritatively approach some of these ideas in a way that really hasn't been done previously. So what is this paper about? Well, you can read it at your leisure. It is quite long, but you can take a look at it. And I'm just going to take you through one or two of the ideas that have been out there and what an initial response is. But basically, our paper highlights that if you think about some essential criteria that pretty much every project or every polar mission has to consider about cost, about feasibility, about environmental protection, and as well as other things, these geoengineering ideas sort of fail on more than one of those hurdles. And actually, for some of those hurdles, they're just insurmountable, actually. And what we're starting to see is sort of in some areas, some of the proponents are just blindly marching ahead with this, trying to gain visibility, trying to gain traction wherever it is, oblivious to the obvious that it can't happen for a number of different reasons. So, of course, one is that some of these interventions are either going to intentionally introduce a pollutant of some form into the natural environment, or a physical intervention into the natural environment that would have damage to the environment. There's in the polar regions, there are complex environmental protection and governance frameworks, different in the Antarctic to the Arctic, of course, but nonetheless, they still exist. And what we're talking about with these interventions will be very broad interventions at a sort of continental type of scale, and the governance frameworks really don't exist to help them. A lot of these things, of course, are going to cost a lot of money to do. I mean, a lot of money, billions of dollars to do, much more, I should say, than the world spends on polar research at the moment. So there's a level of funding that would be needed to launch some of these missions in a way that just doesn't exist at the moment. And it's not just the launching of them, but it's the maintaining of them that would also require lots and lots of money as well. And actually what we're talking about in many instances is like an industrialization of some of the most inhospitable, remote places to do anything on the planet that will be dark for 6 months a year. So these are difficult to see how they could ever happen. Of course, there is an alternative, and that is to decarbonize really quickly, and it is to think about marine protected areas and ASPAs, which are scientifically protected areas in Antarctica. And there are ways in which the existing governance can support protection of the polar regions, which we think is really vital. Final thing to say before we march on to some of the examples is that if you are a fossil fuel company or with vested interest in making money out of fossil fuels, and you want to continue to do that in the coming decades, the idea that you can mask or solve the climate crisis in a way that doesn't involve reducing carbon dioxide emissions, this geoengineering idea globally, but particularly in polar regions, is like a gift to those people with vested interests. And I'm not saying that the people who are proposing geoengineering ideas have those vested interests. I'm not really saying that at all. But what I am saying is that if you do have those vested interests, this is something you'll be keen to support because it pretense of solving a climate crisis without actually solving the root problem, which is, of course, fossil fuel burning and CO2 atmospheric concentrations. So that's the preamble. Let's get into some of the ideas. We're going to go through a whole series of them for you. So atmospheric aerosol injection. This is a sort of global phenomenon. The idea that you can put aerosols in the air that will act to reflect the sun's energy back out into space without it coming onto the surface of the Earth and therefore cooling it. And it sort of stems from volcanic activity that has had a global cooling effect once that does take place. The idea you put sulfates into the atmosphere. There are all sorts of problems in doing that. It has to be a global intervention of a pollutant that will have a consequence in terms of the acidity of the rainfall and ocean acidification and things like that. But if you don't do it globally, then of course there'll be artificial gradients and things, heat gradients introduced into the atmosphere that will have further disturbances in weather patterns. So it has to be done in the polar regions. The problem is, if you do it in the polar regions over the winter time when it's dark, it could act as a warming effect, of course, because it can let the heat escape. Also, the level of intervention you would need to do is colossal. I mean, a whole series of aeroplanes that don't exist at the moment, by the way, they'd have to be generated and built, constantly flying into the atmosphere and constantly putting sulfates in. Of course, in the polar regions, in the Arctic, there's only a certain amount of time you will be able to do that. And so there would have to be some creative, imaginative intervention at certain times, but not in others. And I just don't think that any of that's really been thought about. Of course, the massive downside is ocean acidification as that goes on. And of course, this has to be done alongside reducing carbon dioxide emissions, because if it isn't, and the CO2 level keeps going up and up, this intervention becomes permanent. You just have to keep doing it, because if you stop doing it, there's something called the termination shock, because a world with, say, 550 parts per million and atmospheric aerosol injections to cool the planet, if you stop the atmospheric aerosol injections, then there's a massive temperature shock that would happen very quickly after that. And so, this is a world we need really to avoid at all costs. The next idea that we wanted to investigate is the sea curtain idea. So this is something that's been proposed for several years, where you intervene with an artificial barrier into the Southern Ocean, Amazon Bay, for example, protecting Thwaites Glacier from invading warm water from the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And that barrier stops that warmth from getting close to the ice edge, and therefore stops it from melting. Now, that all sounds fine. If you had a diagram, I'm sure that works out. But what we're talking about, for example, in the Amazon Bay region, is one of the most inhospitable places that you would ever do any work at all. And there are seasons where ice strength and icebreakers just don't get in any way. This barrier will be one of I think the largest human construction of an ocean system that's ever been done, 80 kilometers or so in length, with materials that we don't really know what would work in an environment that is really hostile. It would cost tens of billions, of course, to implement and to maintain. The seafloor is far from smooth, so the idea that you could drape something over it and it would work is very, very contentious. And of course, if that wasn't bad enough, the intervention you would cause and the disruption you would cause to the marine biological environment would be severe. And so really, for that reason alone, and given the Antarctic Treaty's protocol and environmental protection, it would pretty much forbid this type of activity from ever happening. So we just think it's a non-starter for several reasons. Then you have the idea of trying to enhance or replace the albedo effect of sea ice in the Arctic. It could be the Antarctic as well, of course, and doing that in a number of different ways. The first idea is with reducing Arctic sea ice extent, you can replace that with throwing glass beads onto the ocean surface or even onto the sea ice itself. And those glass beads would act to reflect the sun's radiation from that space. There's all sorts of reasons for why this isn't a very good idea. Firstly, it is a pollutant that will be put in to the system. Second reason is that it's far from certain that albedo effect will remain positive. It might well be through sort of algal growth onto the glass beads that actually would become quite a dark surface and start absorbing rather than reflecting sun's radiation. But also there are governance issues here as well. So when we're talking about the Arctic, we're talking also about national sovereignty, and the Arctic Ocean is, it's a contested and congested space, but it does have sovereignty rights. And so for one country to install this type of process or intervention, it would have to be absolutely certain that whatever they did, this pollutant that you would put on the surface wouldn't go across national borders. And of course, you can't guarantee that. And so it is absolutely challenging from a governance perspective to see how any of this would really work. Then there was the sea ice thickening idea, which has got quite a lot of attention. Actually, you probably would have heard about these ideas that are out there. The idea that you can pump the ocean water, throw it into the atmosphere, let it freeze the snow, and then falls on the surface, and some other things as well. No doubt that actually at a small scale you could probably do that, and it's kind of been demonstrated. Actually, you can go into a field or a bay and do that, but only really at a small scale. When we're talking about Arctic sea ice and the need to protect Arctic sea ice, I mean, the amount of Arctic sea ice is somewhere, 10, 14 million square kilometers. And, that's a huge area that will ultimately need protecting over coming decades with certainly under strong warming futures. And, the interventions you would have to make would be unimaginably large at a scale that we just can't comprehend. And so just to put the numbers into context, just say you wanted to protect 1 million square kilometers, 10% of it all, and you had a device that could somehow cover as a kilometer squared, which would be a massive device, wouldn't it? If you just think about that, be like the Eiffel Tower or something. A kilometer squared is absolutely enormous area, but you need 1 million of them to cover 1 million square kilometers. And if you decided, we're going to sort of introduce 1,000 of these per year, you still need 1,000 years to cover it. So it's like the scale of the challenge and the time that we have to solve this climate crisis, in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, this solution just isn't one. And it's the scale that really kills this idea. Then there's an idea to drill into the Antarctic ice sheet to pump out water from the bottom of the ice sheet, and in so doing, reduce the amount of lubrication at the bottom of the ice sheet, increase the friction, and slow the ice down. So this is something that a lot of us on this call will have expertise of. And there's a number of reasons why this is really difficult to see ever happening in any time in the future. Firstly, it's really difficult to do this type of work, and we know that. If you're trying to put a borehole down and pump the water out, the water at depth is going to be below the freezing temperature at the surface. So it's going to be like -1.5 degrees centigrade or something like that. And as it comes up, it will start to freeze itself into the borehole. And we know that has happened when Russian scientists accessed Lake Vostok. There was a hydrological shock and water rushed from the lake into the borehole because the borehole was under pressure compared to the pressure of the water in the lake. But that lake water pretty much froze itself into the borehole. And so, extracting it from the ice surface means that this borehole is going to have to be heated all the way from the surface to the bottom. And even if it is successful, say you manage to do that and you slow the ice sheet, well, you simply just change the orientation and the configuration of the ice sheet. Subglacial water flow paths are dictated 10 times more by the surface elevation of the ice and the base of water pressure effect that it has, as opposed to the basal topography. And so if you just change the ice flow, you change the ice sheet surface shape, and you just change the water direction. So you have to kind of go somewhere else like immediately. So, this whole thing is strewn with problems. You probably need dozens of these things, maybe even more than that. The power you would need to drill a hole is on the megawatt scale. And that is really seriously large amount of power to have in really remote places and at a level that just doesn't exist at the moment. So again, these whole ideas are just full of what we think are insurmountable problems. Ocean fertilization, so the idea of putting iron into the oceans to enhance as a fertilizer, to enhance biological activity, and in so doing drawing down carbon dioxide. That's been around for quite a long time. It hasn't really been particularly successful in some of the trials that have been demonstrated, but there's a real problem with the nutrients and the biology of the marine environment, where this type of intervention at a scale that would make any tangible difference to the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, it would be really difficult to see. This isn't a natural intervention. This is an artificial intentional contaminant, and that would be a real problem for fisheries and for biology in the oceans as well. There's also the idea of the problem of national sovereignty. Especially when it comes to fisheries, you're doing something in one part of the ocean, it will flow into another part of the ocean, and the governance that could support and arrange that just doesn't exist at the moment. So again, it's probably a non-starter. So when you look at these things from 6 objective criteria, are they likely to happen? Are they likely to work? And actually, when you think about them, they're just really, the science behind it is a bit iffy. But even if you think, okay, what we need to do is do some more research to bottom that out a little bit further, you can look at the other criteria. So one is environmental damage. What are you going to be doing? Some people refer to it as like unintended consequences, but actually we can think about it more as just obvious. It's not really unintended if you know it's going to happen. And so there are lots of examples of how intervening with an injection of a pollutant or with an artificial intervention into a natural system will have effects that we don't want. They will cost a lot of money at a scale that we really don't have at the moment. We're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds is going to be needed, or dollars, or whatever currency you want to choose. And that is just money that doesn't exist at the moment. So I just don't know where that would be magicked up from. No governance exists that can oversee this sort of thing. In fact, the only governance that we have in Antarctica and in the Arctic would act to stop this type of activity. And so you'd need to sort of dismantle the existing governance frameworks and invent some other things in order for this to happen. At the spatial and temporal scales that we need to make a tangible difference to the climate crisis, which is in the coming decades, none of these are going to work at the level that's really required. And of course, as I said at the start, if you are a company with vested interests, just keeping the money flowing by burning fossil fuels, these ideas are a gift to you, because it offers you the opportunity to invest in something with the pretense of solving a problem, knowing full well that you're not doing it. So that is a short presentation. There are some positive things that we think can be done, because it's not all negative. And one is, of course, we need to decarbonize. And in fact, even some of these ideas, if you were sort of worried about, have we got the message right? Are we trying to convince policymakers that they really, really need to decarbonize? Well, actually, some of these geoengineering ideas are so crazy that should add to our determination to decarbonize, because, if we don't do that, some of these ideas are going to get even more attention. So that's that. There are marine protected areas that we need to think about. Thinking about the whole of the Arctic, the whole of the Southern Ocean as a marine protected area would be a fantastic thing. When we're talking about the polar regions, these are fragile, vulnerable environments, and any intervention, even low-level scientific interventions, as we all know, they will have environmental consequences, which is why anything that we do in Antarctica has to go through the Committee on Environmental Protection to make sure that we're minimizing the effect, our footprint in Antarctica. And there are Antarctic specially protected areas as well that we can think about in terms of making sure that some of these interventions and things really don't ever happen. These are just sensible plans. They're in line with existing governance frameworks. They stem from existing governance frameworks, and those are the things we need to double down on to make sure that Antarctica is protected as well. So that's the end of my presentation, 20 minutes, I hope. I'm really happy with Flo and Mike and others that are involved to answer any questions that you might have about that. And what I think I'll do is I'll stop sharing now so we can see each other. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Martin. Much appreciated. And yes, 20 minutes, bang on. Thank you. So what I suggest we do then for a discussion, we've got about half an hour. So I'll ask people to use the React raise hand function if you want to either comment, ask a question, give context. This is happening in a wider framework. We're talking about polar today, but of course there is a wider debate going on about geoengineering more globally. So people have seen the EU scientific advisors have recently come up with a report on this, and with along very similar lines, which is the governance is not in place to do these things and so on. So looks like Catherine, you're going to get the first question or comment.
Yes, I think that the main difficulty we are facing is that even if the scientists don't agree that it is a bad idea, some people will do it. And the question of money, because petroleum industry is so interested in that as a way to propose a technical solution to climate change, I think the money will not be such a big issue for them. For us, yes, but for them.
Thanks, Kat. Should we take a question from Frank and then Martin, you take them together?
Sure. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Martin. Hi, Mike. Thank you very much for this presentation. But most of the focus of that presentation and the discussion and the paper is about the danger of the implementation of these proposed interventions, but much less is about whether any of those implementations would ever be useful or potentially solve the problem they are designed for. And so modeling is a great opportunity and a great tool, and probably the only tool that you can use to investigate whether any of those interventions or implementations would really get to their target. So I was wondering whether we as modelers somewhere would have the moral obligation to react on this and say something. I know that there are already some studies, not that they immediately talk about geoengineering, but there are studies that show that, for instance, if you stop inflow of circumpolar deep water into AIDS, you stop that immediately, it doesn't stop or reverse mass loss. So that is already one of such studies. So that is my question about our moral obligation.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks, Kat, as well.
I've got the RoGAP question, money not really a problem for fossil fuels, and then is there a moral obligation to actually investigate some?
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So these interventions cost a lot of money, actually. And we're talking hundreds of billions. Fossil fuel profits are quite large, but an individual company, that would be an awful thing for them to try to cough up. My experience with fossil fuel companies is they're very protective of their profits. And so they want to see the profits coming in and dishing out money at this sort of scale that will have significant negative reputational effects. I wonder whether they would be able to do that. So probably be a bit more subtle somehow in supporting these things rather than with large amounts of money. I suspect it will be more sort of small amounts of money just to sort of keep these things on the table with the pretense of helping rather than actually ever doing it, because it would really cost an awful lot. In terms of modeling, Frank, yeah, you're absolutely right. And in the paper, we do refer to some studies that have been done where the results have either come out sort of negatively or ambiguously in relation to some of these ideas. And of course, it is a reasonable thing to do. Yes, can they work? Well, I think at the scale that's really needed, the practicalities of these things isn't something you necessarily need to model. But I think that's an important thing, because you can model anything, right? And you can sort of put a barrier into the Southern Ocean and there we go, the water stops. But the practicality of it is just so unimaginably challenging, then it's almost not worth doing, because it realistically is not going to happen, is it? You're not going to put an 80-kilometer barrier into the most hostile environment in the world and maintain it over many decades. I mean, it's like not possible. So you can model it if you like, but I mean, there are other considerations, I think, which are easier to sort of shout about and just say these will never happen. And I think from the Antarctic perspective, the governance arrangements that exist at the moment are there to protect Antarctica, right? They're there to protect interventions like this from ever happening. And actually what we're starting to see with some of these ideas that are being proposed are sort of implicit criticisms of those governance arrangements, because they don't like them, because they're acting to stop them. And we've seen that in some recent articles coming out, challenging the idea of Antarctic governance by people in Antarctica, and there should be other people around the world somehow that can decide what goes on in Antarctica. And it's a chiseling away at these hard fought and hard won governance frameworks that we have at the moment. And we have to be really careful about that, because once we start to sort of take away these international institutions that are there to protect our environments, we're in a different place. And so I'm starting to see, subtly at the moment, but quite worrying behavior from some of these groups against what we think are, what we know works really well, and that's the governance in environmental protection in Antarctica. But from a modeling perspective, which is your original question, yes, there have been models. and some of them we do refer to in the paper. Of course, as a model yourself and others will be here, you can model anything. Of course, it's up to you. But I think there are other things that we might point to as being insurmountable challenges to some of these ideas, and they don't really need modeling to do that. Sorry, that's my answer. That's all right.
Roderick.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about the impression this paper is going to make to the outside world. So the non-glaciologists, they will see this paper, and they also have these papers which are proposing these suggestions, and they probably see that there is a dispute. That will be their bottom line. More a journalistic point of view than really a scientific point of view. So I wonder to what extent this paper is going to contribute to solve the issue, and whether you consider to try to include some of the people who propose these ideas, like the curtains. Did you try to contact those people, and whether they were willing to contribute to the paper and somehow bring forward their arguments, rather than just putting out the paper which argues that all the ideas are ridiculous, which I think they are, but the outsiders will not be able to judge this.
That's a really, really good point, and we did think really carefully about the style of the paper. And among the group of authors, there were others that were, some of them, I won't say who they were much more forceful in responding to this issue than the paper actually turned out to be, funny enough. I think what we wanted to do, and I go back to advice that was given to me 30 odd years ago by Gordon Robin, and some people here will remember Gordon, of course, and he said, if you've got something you don't like in the science, the best place to have that argument is in the literature, right? Because it stays in the literature. And what I was noticing, and you may have noticed it as well, is that some of these ideas were going essentially unchallenged. And so, they were just sort of being put out there, getting traction in the media and doing those other things, but without any academic counterweight collectively in the literature. And that's what we wanted to provide, which was a broad, collective, reasonable assessment of these ideas, and to put that into literature so that it can be used in future by whoever wants to look at it as an alternative narrative, if you like, to these ideas. Then because it's in the literature, it won't go away. If you start to sort of think about the way that you quite reasonably propose, shouldn't we just have a sort of dialogue and a discussion, then it all gets sort of diluted, right? And I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think personally what's needed, and I think colleagues and co-authors agree with this, is that there needs to be almost like a stake in the ground. We need to say that these ideas they've kind of gone too far, and what we want to do is to create a paper that is referable, citable, and just points these things out. Now, of course, you might disagree with it. You might agree with it. You might disagree with it. Well, that's fine, but it will be there, and it will be there for others to look at. And because it's in the literature and because it's undiluted, it's not something that can go away. So if, for example, you were a proponent of one of these ideas and you wanted to stay challenging it and making it happen, the criticisms that we pull up in this paper, they won't go away. You're going to have to deal with them. And these are sort of criticisms and that they will already have known about, but they've just ignored them. And so I think that's why the rationale that we chose to write the paper in the way that we did is to really make it known that there is an alternative. And I think from a large proportion of our community, an opinion that these things can't happen, and for the reasons that we spell out. There may be some other ones as well, but I think as importantly, it's for the proponents to explain somehow how they can overcome them, and I just can't see how that can be done. So that's kind of why we wrote the paper in the way that we did.
Roderick, I can maybe provide one other little bit of context which might help explain the nature of the paper, which is part of the request for this paper came from climate negotiators and ministers, ministerial level, actors in climate negotiations, who were saying we're seeing these proposals, some of them in the literature, but certainly some very nice presentations at these meetings. But we're not hearing a counter view, and we're not hearing about the other consequences, the biological impacts, the governance issues, and so on, because they simply don't talk about them in their things. They see it as an engineering problem. And so there was almost a request to actually put out this alternative view so that they can at least then judge them. So they can at least say, okay, right, so these are what a group of polar experts actually think these might also do. Some of these, what they call unintended consequences, but I think some of us think are highly predictable consequences. So there was also a little bit of context of a request to do this.
Yeah, I can see that, but I also a bit scared for their final judgment, that this is not going to convince them completely, that they think maybe yeah, maybe no. I don't see a solution to this, but if you meet those people next year on the COP 30, do you believe that they are then, by this paper, convinced that these ideas are not going to work out? I doubt, but...
No, I doubt it as well, Roderick. And actually what we're starting to see is I think there are very few scientists that are really proponents of this. I mean, there are some, but I think there is a very large majority who just know the obvious and go against it. And it's actually, the community needs to sort of speak up about this in a way that we've been quite silent over previous years. But what we're also starting to see is that there are startups, businesses that are being set up to do some of these things, and it's no longer science. And of course, if you're a startup company, then you're generating some intellectual property, which somehow you want to sell. That you have this idea that you're going to save the planet, whatever it is. But actually, for any startup, your plan probably will be to generate some IP to enhance the value of that IP, and you'll do that through publicity and by getting noticed, and then you'll sell it, right? And you'll make a bit of money. And at the expense, of course, of all of us here trying to understand these things. And so I think there is, it's not necessarily driven by the scientific community at all. It's sort of engineering interventions and engineers and startups, and we're starting to see that in other places. So I don't really think it's a scientific debate. Actually, I think it's more subtle than that.
I think if I could add one other thing, Roderick, and I think maybe you're hinting at this, is I think one thing as a scientific community we need to be very careful about is labeling each other and thinking there's sides to this. I think everybody in this discussion, including on this call, will be somewhere on a spectrum from perhaps no geoengineering through to we have to try some stuff. And I think where we are on that, it will vary, and we need to recognise that people who are opposing some of the things that have been talked about here are not Luddites, they're not anti-technology, they're not naive, and likewise, some of the ones proposing it are not uninterested in trying to decarbonize and trying to solve climate change. So I think we shouldn't guess at people's motivations, but also to recognize that we need to be really careful not to fall into camps too badly, into sides. I think we are on a spectrum. Most of the people I talk to in science, they're quite happy with a lot of carbon dioxide removal technologies, tree planting and some of the basics, some of the other direct air capture, of course, less so. But and then some might be happy with some of these, but we shouldn't drop people into kind of pigeonholes. I think that's one danger we do have. And I think we talked a lot about that in this paper.
I've got to tell you also, Mike, just to say that I had a sort of response. I've had one or two responses on this. I don't intend, by the way, for this to sort of follow the rest of my career, by the way. It's something I think needs to be done, and we need to say it, and we need to say it clearly, right? And then that's for others to respond to, right? And that's why getting something in. But on the issue of logistics, and the level of logistics that will be needed to do some of these things is at a scale that we don't have at the moment. And so I challenged, I'm not going to say who they were, but they're quite well known, about how this logistic is ever going to happen, and then how you get the power that's needed into these remote places. Remember, megawatts of power to do a drill. You're going to need many of these megawatts. The response was you could put an aircraft carrier into the Amazon Sea and allow that to be the logistics hub, and you could put a nuclear a modular nuclear reactor onto the ice sheet to provide the power. But if that's the level of sort of intellectual discussion that we're having, we don't really want to have it, right? And I think that's why putting quite a firm response to these ideas now, which is what our paper is, I think it's actually quite important that we do it that way, because these ideas, I mean, the solution to some of the ideas that we're coming out with, that seem even more lunatic than the original ideas.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, actually, I have, sorry. So, I mean, then a few weeks ago, some colleagues published this EOS paper about the fact that some of them are still willing to put some effort into the research of this. So how do we handle the discussion within the community about that? Because to me, it sounded like a response to this paper. I mean, our paper, and they claim the fact that we are not the one definitely that could decide about whether or not researching on these topics or not. So I was wondering how do we discuss with our colleagues that definitely put some efforts into the research for geoengineering?
Interesting, isn't it? Because I saw that as well, and I kind of ignored it really, because I saw that as a preemptive strike as well. And I think the message was, it's not for glaciologists to make these decisions. Well, I don't want to make any decisions, right? And it's you know, and as a glaciologist, that's fine. But actually, if you look at the authors in our paper, we're not all glaciologists. There's marine biologists, there's oceanographers, you know, atmospheric scientists, policymakers, you name it, right? And so who is it for to make these decisions? Well, actually, it's for governance arrangements to do that. That's what the governance is for. So I thought that it was a bit of a sort of bit of an own goal, actually. I really wasn't quite sure what they're getting at. But what I did notice in that paper was what I referred to at the beginning, was the sort of, because the governance is very unlikely to support some of these ideas, they'd want to create an alternative governance, and just because it suits them to do so. And I think that becomes very dangerous when we look at our structures, our organizations, our institutions, and they don't do the things that we want them to do, you know, personally. So we're going to have some other institutions to do that. I think that becomes a very difficult. I can't accept that type of response, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Martin. Any other thoughts about that? You all need to think about it. It's not an easy matter.
Carlotta.
Sorry, my hand, for whatever reason, didn't rise. But well, I think that as a community, the only thing we can do is really provide the science bases. You know, we have to provide the, like Frank said, in some cases, the models, other cases, the disruption to the communities, to the ecosystems, and so on and so forth, and not put ourselves in any of these places, in this spectrum, Mike, that you were mentioning. You know, we just have to be scientists and speak to what the effects of these, what it looks crazy ideas, you know, but the crazy ideas of today may be something feasible in the future, unless we try to do something. I'm a little worried because we are at a very delicate point in the geopolitical level. And I think that's something we ought to have in consideration, you know, maybe in a different world scheme, we should be more relaxed about something like this. But at this time, and the things that are going on right now, for example, at the Antarctic Treaty, you know, like these marine protected areas, which would be fantastic to have, and but we're having so many challenges to get them through. So I think it is something that we should try to educate as much to the governance and to the public and everybody with our scientific basis about the risks that these projects might have. That's all. I'm worried about the geopolitical context, really. That's all.
Thanks, Carlotta. I'm detecting Kat.
Yes, I was thinking that maybe it would be useful for all scientists to have a better knowledge of the feasibility, how much it costs and how much energy it requires to implement this type of solution, because we see that it is crazy, but we don't have, for instance, if I give an outreach somewhere, I don't have the numbers to just say to make people understand the scale that would be needed to be efficient, if it is efficient, even without looking at the drawback of any solution. And I think it would be useful to have some work on how to communicate about this, because very often the journalists ask us, and what could be done?
Yeah, thank you, Kat. I think that, you know, putting any amount of power and logistic into remote, challenging, hostile environments is it's really difficult. And it sounds, when you say really difficult, we all know here, it's like, that's like an understatement, isn't it? It's extremely challenging. And to do something above the type of work that we do, it's going to be at a level that we've never seen, right? And it's sort of the industrialization of these places. You know, the idea that you could sort of draw up an aircraft carrier, anchor it into the Amazon Sea, and that'll all be fine. You know, it's like, of course you can't. Right? That's, I mean, there are all sorts of, I mean, you have to be ice strengthened somehow. I mean, get frozen in or something. You know, it's just ridiculous. Or a nuclear reactor on the ice. Of course, it's not going to happen. So there's a sort of, it's almost like a science fiction that's being generated. And I think it's at that level that we need to probably respond to it. That it is only, it is a science fiction, this idea that somehow we can, you know, manipulate our planet in this way, and do that quickly. Just think it's absurd.
Okay, thanks, Kat. I think if there aren't any more questions, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat, Flo's put in the link to the EOS opinion piece on glacier intervention research. Anybody wants to have a look at that? But I think I'm going to close it off. I'll hand over to Flo in a second, but really just to thank everybody for giving their time today. This is obviously something coming up the agenda fast, and particularly to thank Martin for putting his head above the parapet and giving a 20-minute talk on that, but very much coordinating and leading on this paper, which I think we've tried to explain the context as to why this paper is needed. So thanks, Martin, for doing that. Thanks, everybody, for attending. I'm just going to ask Flo to see what she wants to say about the next steps with Instant and whether we'll have another webinar in due course.
Well, so the idea was to organize another couple of seminars. I've been attending a curious workshop last year funded by Frederick Paulson on an island of the North Sea, and it was all about the feasibility of geoengineering in polar regions. There were not only scientists but also social scientists, and a couple of them were raised some very interesting discussions, and I really would like, they're both young scientists actually, and I really would like to give them the chance to talk about that, because it's their point of view was very interesting. It's more a social historical evolution of that. So the idea is to follow on with these webinars and then see how it evolves. I mean, if any of you is willing to share discussion about these matters or would like to have more discussion about the specific matters, then we can definitely try to organize and contact people. So the idea with Instant was really to be able to hear different voices, different directions, and then to inform SCAR also, because we have created a climate standing group that will also try to take care transferring some information to the Antarctic Treaty System as well. So the idea is that, yeah, there will be a follow-up through the Antarctic Treaty System discussions, but then we need to have broad discussion in the scientific community and social sciences and etc. So if you have some ideas also for future discussion, or if you personally wish to discuss more about one of these aspects, then we definitely might help to organize and trigger the discussions.
Okay, Flo, I think there's an invite there for anybody if they want to try and propose something in the incident framework, then we can help. Certainly Flo and Tim can help organize that.
Yeah, thanks Martin for sharing the slides in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, in which case I think we'll close it off, Flo, and just to again thank everyone for their time and have a good day.
Bye everyone. Thanks
Bye.
for attending.
Thanks a lot.